Hey YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Time for the outsiders, but no first dog on the moon. I guess the ABC is self-censoring again. But anyway, today they're going to talk about the composition of the new Australian Senate, the strength of its crossbench, and Rolf the Rockspider hairy arse.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not.
And joining me for Outsiders this week, Professor of Law at the University of Queensland, Jim Allen, National Affairs Editor at the Courier Mail, Dennis Atkins, and Corporate Communications Specialist, Paula Matthewson. First up this morning, Rolf Harris, the veteran entertainer, has been sentenced to 5 years for child sex offences, and it's left many people conflicted over how to treat his artwork and music. The ARIA Hall of Fame has already expelled him, and his hometown of Bassendean has voted to strip Harris of honours and remove all his art from display.
We had our residents say that it was inappropriate to have his image up, considering the seriousness of the allegations, and obviously with concerns regarding the victims, because what we didn't want to do is to look like there was a protection racket for somebody. Because you're prominent, famous and an icon, you're not actually going to have repercussions.
I just think as a piece sitting there reminding us that Rolf Harris whacked it on the wall there in 1986, whenever it was, when he was actually abusing children at the time, is revolting.
That was Warrnambool resident Carol Altman, who thinks a Rolf Harris mural in the town should not be preserved. And before that, John Gangel, Mayor of Bassendean in WA, Rolf Harris's hometown. Carol Altman, let's start with you. There was shock, obviously, when Harris was first charged with criminality. He was so much a part of what it meant to be Australian for so long. Does his fall damage our collective psyche, do you think? Oh, sorry, I'm Paula. I'm sorry, I called you Carol. Paula Matthewson.
You did. Does it damage our collective psyche? Probably. It's certainly not the first well-loved celebrity, I suppose, to have toppled from the pedestal. And I think it's very important in this case of abuse of children and young women that take place. So if there is damage to our psyche, it's probably well worth it. I mean, the exposure is important in that it's important in terms of healing. It's important in terms of those who have been abused feeling more comfort in coming forward. But I think it's also okay for us as observers of this tragedy, I suppose, to grieve a little that we have lost the memories that we have of Harris.
And Dennis Atkins, I mean, he was, wasn't he? He was such a symbol, in a sense, of Australianness. He wasn't necessarily a reflection of your average Australian, but he did kind of represent us as a cultural symbol, didn't he?
Yes, well, certainly in the 60s and 70s. I remember my father was an enormous fan of Rolf Harris, and as a family we would watch the Rolf Harris show on television in black and white on Saturday night, and my father just loved every minute of it. He would laugh at all the gags, he would sing along to the songs. You know, it was a core part of my father's life. To me it seemed like an Australia, or that Rolf Harris was representing an Australia which I didn't see outside of my own home in the late 60s and early 70s. It seemed more like an Australia that was more 50s, and I think that's partly why my father liked it so much. So it didn't connect with me, but it did connect with my father's generation, and then it connected with an enormous part of the British population, because Rolf Harris made his name and his fame more in Britain as an Aussie on the world stage than he did in Australia.
Paula, just back to you, just briefly. I mean, he was a symbol, I guess, of that old-fashioned Australia, but he was still very popular with kids, wasn't he? Because he had a I think it was RSPCA program, a program about animals on television.
Yes, indeed, and I think it's probably one of the biggest messages that comes from this situation is that it's a reminder for us that those who prey on children and abuse our women are probably known to them or are familiar to them in some way. So, I mean, that's an uncomfortable message for all of us to have to deal with, and this is another occasion on which it is presented to us. And so I think it really is a challenge for those of us who are observing to not put our fingers in our ears and close our eyes and go la 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 and say I just don't really want to know about this, but to really focus on the fact that this is a real issue that is going on in people's lives every day, and we need to open our ears and eyes to it.
Jim Allen from the University of Queensland. We've got Rolf Harris as a symbol there, as a symbol of I guess what it means to be Australian. We've also in recent times had all of the evidence about child abuse within the Salvation Army, the Salvos, and you know the old saying, thank God for the Salvos. They're very much a part of Australian culture and fabric. Is it damaging to our national psyche? Your thoughts?
Well, firstly, I grew up in Canada, so I didn't even know who he was. He had no impact, Rolf Harris, in Canada at all. I'm a bit more skeptical, I think, than you guys. I mean, if you look for equivalents, I guess O.J. Simpson in the U.S. was a big figure, and he was a murderer, after all, in all likelihood. And nobody even talks about him anymore except as a joke, or Princess Diana in another sense, where there's almost this huge outpouring of grief, and then they've forgotten this is an entertainer who was a nasty piece of work, and it seems a bit overblown to me to then turn it into something about the national psyche, whatever that means. I'm not even sure what that means. On the Salvation Army, again, you know, there's some people who did some terrible things. Will that affect? My wife and I, we give to the Salvation Army. They seem to do pretty good work to me. There's a few really bad apples, but look at
the Red Shield was right down, wasn't it, this year though?
Well, I mean, when you look at other top-level organizations, say Amnesty International giving £800,000 of their top 2 people to get rid of them, does that affect your giving? Greenpeace going on and on about flying and carbon. It turns out we learned in the last couple of weeks that they're flying a guy in from Luxembourg every day, a massive amount of flying. So there's hypocrisy and bad acting everywhere, and what you want is a charity that deals with it and moves on. So, I mean, it is terrible what they did, but do they do good work? So I think that's at the end of the day. Before you give money, you ask yourself, how much goes to administration and what are they doing?
Dennis, our sense of trust with organisations like the Salvos, I mean, they're not the only one, of course, but then also with the figures, with our identities like Rolf Harris, and of course, don't forget there was Robert Hughes, who was very popular in the Hey Dad series in the 80s. Sense of trust within community, do you think that's an issue? I mean, do you think we're more suspicious of organisations, or will be, because of the spate of scandals that we've had in recent times?
Well, I think we have become more suspicious, and also people have become less fearful of speaking out about what happened. I mean, one of the things that sort of unites, say, Rolf Harris, Dave Hughes, Robert Hughes, and the Salvos, is that while there were people, you know, in the first 2 individuals, and then people within the Salvation Army who did do terrible things, who were, you know, in some senses quite, you know, evil people, there was also a culture around them that protected them. You know, there were all these stories about during the 1970s and 80s when people would excuse Rolf Harris's behaviour among young girls and saying that's Rolf being Rolf. When Robert Hughes would be, sort of excused for his behaviour, and within the Salvation Army, where the hierarchy in the Salvation Army would cover up and protect in the same way some of the churches have done. Yeah. So that culture, I think, is broken down, and I think that's a very good thing. And you know, the more we are exposed to these things that happened in the past, hopefully we won't allow these sort of acts to be protected and covered up in the future.
And Paula, just before we move on, do you agree with what Dennis has just said?
Yes, I do. And the flip side of that, of course, from a communications perspective, is that in the case of the Salvos, people will look at their own what I call the trust bank. How much trust have the salvos built up in their trust bank with each individual? And in Australia, I think there are many of us who have benefited from the generosity of the salvos at some point in their lives. So they certainly have a better chance of rebuilding that trust as a result of what has occurred. In comparison to these other situations where people haven't necessarily had any direct experience with Rolf Harris or with any other celebrities, and the trust is totally dissipated and would never return.
All right, well, let's move on to the second topic we wanted to talk about today. Let's look at the 12 new senators who will be formally sworn into Parliament on Monday.
Oh, I just don't get into the power games at all, so I'm just going to come up here and do the best job I possibly can for Tasmania, our veterans, and see how I go. The last month has really dragged on. I just really want to get in there. I want to see the legislation in black and white and get my teeth into it, stately.
One of Clive Palmer's 3 senators in the new chamber, Tasmanian Jackie Lambie, speaking to RN Breakfast earlier in the week. Dennis Atkins, if I can come back to you, why does the media, correct me if I'm wrong, why does the media insist on the narrative that all crossbench members and senators are intrinsically either nutters or mavericks?
Well, because that fits the media stereotype. We had the big parties and the National Party and the National Liberal Party and the Labor Party, and they're sort of, as they like to keep telling us, sort of slightly broad churches. They have some very spectacularly bright and able people, but they also have some plodders, and occasionally they'll have some nutters, but they're sort of pushed to the background. These guys, when they come in as either members of a very small party or as independents, they're sort of within the spotlight, and it's shining on them. So their inability to get on top of things, their nuttiness or their idiosyncrasies are magnified, and the media then says, "Aha! Look at that! There's a nutter."
And yet they've been elected, democratically elected. Does it do any good for the press gallery to always focus on their idiosyncrasies?
No, well, I think we should look at them and take them on their merits. I mean, we heard there from Jackie Lambie, who's the Palmer United Party senator from Tasmania. Now, she's quite a fascinating person. I've read some long interviews with her. She's one of the ones who has put herself out there and let Australia get a glimpse of actually who she is. Now, she mightn't measure up to the job, but I think she's interesting. She's got a voice. She's got very strong views about Tasmania. She's got very strong views about the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, and I think she's going to be one of the more interesting characters.
Jim Allen, your thoughts?
Well, I think that people make a big mistake if they don't understand that party politics is a good thing. If you go back 100, 120 years, the executive used to, before party politics really became the way things operated, the executive just picked off independents. And so as a voter, you had no idea what you were going to get. Party politics allows you to have some basic idea of what you're going to get when you elect a government. So I like party politics, and people who have this image of a bunch of independents being elected being a good thing are, I think, wrong. Secondly, where I think I disagree with your question, is this idea that the press has been all over independents. I mean, they were fawning over Oakeshott and Windsor, especially the ABC in Fairfax. They were fawning over those two guys when they jumped in bed with Gillard. There was very little criticism of them until the whole Gillard program started to implode.
There was a lot of early criticism of Oakeshott. I mean, he was made out to be flaky, if not a nutter.
Well, no, the criticism that bites is that they were elected in a constituency that was overwhelmingly right of centre, and they cast themselves as right of centre guys. You see, one of the problems with independence is there's lots of incentives to be on the big spending side of things. You look really good if you're for an NBN, doesn't matter what it costs. There's very little incentive for an independent to say, I'm going to back a policy program of cutting spending because, I don't want my grandkids to be ladled. There's nothing in it for independence. You almost have to want party politics if you have any hope of containing big spending government.
But by party politics, you mean two-party politics, don't you?
Well, even 2.5. I mean, in Canada, there's 2.5 parties. You need big parties. You can live with a half party. I tend to like 2 parties, but 2.5 works too.
Paula Matthewson, I mean, what use do you see for the independence within our political system?
Oh, I'm a I'm a big party person myself, and I was going to jump in when Dennis was saying that this Nutters and Mavericks line is really part of the media narrative. It's much more than that. They are Nutters and Mavericks.
They can't all be. They're not all Nutters and Mavericks. I mean, if you look at Nick Xenophon. Tony Windsor, Andrew Wilkie, Brian Harradine, were they? They all might have been individuals in their own ways, but
they are mavericks. That is the nature of being an independent. That you are rebellious. That you are outside the box. With the box being the major party system. They're outside the mainstream, and the question really is, do they have the interests of the mainstream at heart, or are they going to pursue their pet projects?
But they're being thrown up, though, aren't they, by the voters?
No,
and some would say that they're thrown up in response to a rejection of the two-party system.
Well, I think that's only part of the answer. There were some very quirky variances in the last federal election which threw them up, which isn't necessarily an expression of the voters' democratic will.
Jim, you agree with that?
Well, they're getting 0.something%. I don't like the STV voting system for the upper house to begin with, but the modifications we have of it are not good. The voters had no clue they were electing Ricky Muir. And whatever you say, I watched that interview. It was excruciating to watch. So, he's the only guy outside of President Obama who has a spokesman. There's two people in the entire elected world that have spokesmen, Ricky Muir and President Obama.
Dennis, the system might not always work, but not all of the independents who get up are thrown up because of quirks in the system, are they? They're put in there by people within electorates often.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the last federal election, Nick Xenophon in South Australia outpolled the Labor Party in the Senate vote there. Yes, the system can be gamed, and we've now learnt in pretty graphic terms that the system can be gamed. Now, if a system can be gamed, it should be changed, and the Labor Party and the coalition are looking at ways to change it, to try and stop this gaming that goes on where someone with 0.5% of the vote can leapfrog into a full quota for the Senate. Now, we'll see what they come up with, and we'll see how successful they are. But yes, you do get individuals. Tony Windsor was elected before 2010 in his electorate of New England. Rob Oakeshott was elected in the state seat in New South Wales. I think the voters in those two electorates knew what sort of characters they were. When they did get in. There were problems with them then doing deals with Julia Gillard, because that sort of ran against their individual persona. So yes, not all of these people are unrepresentative, but some of them are.
It would have been nice if they ran for re-election and took their medicine rather than the cowardly way they didn't do that, in my view.
Paula, look, we're running out of time, but just to finish off, we now have quite a significant block of crossbenchers in the Senate. Is that a historical blip, or would you imagine that to continue on in the future? Is this a trend now that's been set?
That we have a large crossbench?
Yes, that's right.
Look, I think it will continue, but the composition of that crossbench will change dependent on those reforms that Dennis has just referred to. So I think we'll see less of the micro-parties gaming the system, but I think we'll see more of an emergence of the Cathy McGowan independents that have a very strong grassroots support base behind them come forward, but that will take a little bit of time.
All right, look, thank you very much to our Outsiders panel this week. Corporate Communications Specialist Paula Matthewson, National Affairs Editor at the Courier-Mail Dennis Atkins, and Professor of Law at the University of Queensland Jim Allen. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Anthony.
And that's it for the show today. Coming up next on 360.
Okay, so sadly no first dog on the moon, but bit interesting about Rolf Harris getting 5 years and 9 months as a head sentence when he's 84 years old. When I first heard that he'd been charged with being a rock spider, somebody who likes to fiddle with little girls. It wasn't actually that particularly surprising. When I very first encountered Rolf Harris on black and white television back in the 60s, I couldn't really understand why an Australian schoolteacher would want to go and live in England and do artwork with a 6-inch paintbrush, singing sort of cartoon caricature type country and western songs. You know, I can recall hearing him sing Timey Kangaroo Down Sport, and I'm pretty sure there was a line in there that said, "Don't let me abos run loose, Bruce, don't let me abos run loose." So like Rolf Harris was a howling bloody racist as well as an opportunistic misogynist pedophile, and he was held up and adulated, adored, as a public symbol of how successful an expatriate Australian could be. And I wonder whether he's just a little bit like those Australian, often Vietnam vintage veterans who got a taste for young Asian women during the 60s and 70s, and they couldn't ever fit back into Australian society, so they went to live in Thailand or the Philippines, or perhaps like Arthur C. Clarke moving to Ceylon, later Sri Lanka, so that he could live in a culture where wearing a caftan and perving on little boys was not considered unusual, or at least it was tolerated because he was a white man and he had money. I wonder if Rolf has gone over to Britain so that whereas Australians might have recognised behaviours and character traits, if he stayed here for any length of time, he might have been picked up and noticed a lot earlier. Whereas when he's immersed in some other culture, he's already got enough discontinuities and jarring notes that nobody ever quite puts two and two together and figures out what he's doing. Pretty interesting that there's already an appeal against the leniency of the sentence. I guess that's to make sure that he doesn't entertain any idea of appealing, claiming that he's too old and he's too frail and he should be let off because, you know, he's Rolf Harris. And he actually bloody started singing Timey Kangaroo Down Sport in the bloody witness stand while he was being examination, or in the dock while he was being cross-examined. It's a really interesting illustration of the feedback loops within the cosmic scoreboard effect, so that people who are fed a heap of bullshit when they're young, so that when he was growing up, he no doubt grew up in a milieu where he was one of the men who thought that they were entitled to have their sexuality indulged by every female they met. He thought it was perfectly okay for him to just grab and grope and squeeze and play with any sweet young thing because he was a man. He was Rolf Harris. He was entitled. It was their duty to satisfy his sexual whims. Okay, so he honestly, genuinely believed that. So when he was young and dumb and full of cum, you might kind of sort of almost excuse him for carrying on like that for a while. And because he had a lot of success, you can see how he would get himself reinforced into the worldview where he was entitled to behave like that. And he had a lot of advantages. So you can see why he might keep going for a while. But you'd expect that over the years, with the increasing public awareness of the damage that being used for an adult's sexual purposes does to a child, you would have thought that he would have stopped. You might have thought that he could have looked at it himself and considered the amount of damage he was doing to other people. You might have thought that when he finally was charged, he might have put his hands up and said, well, yes, he had done it, and he'd woken up to himself and he'd stopped, and he could have gone in there and pleaded guilty. But he just couldn't believe that he had done anything wrong. He's one of those absolute bloody incorrigibles who think that they are put on the planet so that the planet is a playground for them, and everybody who's in it is dramatis personae in their self-indulgent lifetime. So yeah, I think probably you should have got about a 10-year head sentence with a 5-year non-parole rather than 5 years and 9 months head sentence with about a 2.5-year non-parole. Rolf the Rockspider, hairy ass Harris. And he's got a $20 million asset pool that his long list of victims can now take him to court, suing him for damages in the civil system, whereby they don't have to prove beyond a doubt that he has assaulted them and damaged them. They only have to establish within reasonable certainty. It's not a beyond a doubt, but it's on the face of the evidence they have a good enough case that they will get money. Now, how far will $20 million go while he's in jail? And will there be any money to continue paying his daughter Bindi a monthly stipend to be nice to Daddy? And I wonder what chance there is that she might be examined for a possible perjury charge for all of the things that she said when she was in court sticking up for Daddy while she was on his payroll. As Chaucer said, Modre will out. Murder always comes to light, and so does every other bloody, nefarious, horrible, scurrilous thing. Nobody ever actually continues to get away with it forever. I suppose that other English television comedian bloke, was it Savile? He got away with it to the point where he died without ever being charged, but he certainly has no public reputation these days. And I think it was because of him and brouhaha, the public awareness regarding his deeds in the British entertainment industry, that Rolf's victims came out and mentioned what he'd been up to from the 1960s to the late 1980s in England. I'm pretty sure I heard an Australian radio presenter mention how she was groped by him in the mid-1990s. So it's actually arguable whether he ever stopped. But apparently, according to the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse in Institutions in Australia, they reckon the average time lag between being abused and coming forward to talk about it is 22 years for the 9-year-old girls and the 10-year-old boys that were abused in institutions in Australia. And that Royal Commission's still going at the moment. So, I think we'll see what we will see with the Senate in Australia. There are a few Fruit Loops in there. The bloke who calls himself Liberal Democrat, in a masterstroke of mislabelling, he wants deregulation of in-home childcare, particularly when there's one mother looking after several other mothers' children. He just wants it to be easier for children to be abused within the home, apparently. That seems to be the Liberal Democrat senatorial view. He just hasn't got it. That a lot of the people who gravitate towards jobs or situations where they have a power, control, authority role over children, a lot of those people are not actually safe to leave with the children. Perhaps one of the most insightful facets of the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse that's going on at the moment is that people have said, oh, isn't it a terrible thing that the Catholic Church is responsible for 68% of all the children who were sexually abused, and the Anglican Church was only responsible for 12% of the children who were abused, and the other churches, they worked their way down through the remaining percentages. Apparently, there's an exact correlation between the percentage of children being cared for by a particular church. So yes, the Catholic Church inflicted 68% of the child sexual assault done on children in institutions, and the Catholic Church was looking after 68% of the children in institutions. The Anglican Church inflicted 12% of the child sexual assault on children in institutions. The Anglican Church was looking after 12% of the children who were in the institutions. There appears to have been a fixed percentage of abusers in the Catholic Church, in the Anglican Church, in the Salvation Army, in the Boy Scouts, in the boys' homes and the girls' homes. There were abusers in all of the systems. And the way you varied the percentage of the abused children is by varying the percentage of the children going through that particular system. So, I guess we have to look at our ancestors with a bit of a jaundiced eye. We here now are the product of a pretty bloody sick culture, and it's time we looked ourselves in the mirror and thought about that. Warble's on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.